Dr. Williamson, I want to just pick up one matter before we move on to hepatitis C screening. And the one matter deals with notification of post-transfusion hepatitis. In documents that the inquiries looked at previously, the guidance in place in the late 80s was that hospitals were required to notify the transfusion centre of cases of post-transfusion hepatitis. When you were at the centre, roughly, how frequently were instances of post-transfusion hepatitis reported to you?
Yes, I can't recall any. I mean, there must have been. I wasn't the person dealing with them. I imagine there should have been in the time I was there, but I don't recall any particular ones. But I know we certainly had the standard procedure in place, so that if we were notified, we all knew what to do.
And can you just tell us what that standard procedure involved?
So the hospital would have told us the name of the patient, and they would have told us the donation numbers of the blood components that the patient had had. So we would immediately look in the manufacturing records to see whether we had manufactured any other components from the same donation. And if so, where they were they still in our building, which they could have been, for example, if it was frozen plasma, or they might have been issued to the same hospital or other hospitals. So there was a certain amount of urgency to identify the other components, and if they had been issued, to get onto the hospitals who had received them to ask them to send them back. If we had sent plasma from the donation to BPL, then we would have notified BPL as well. Then we keep an archive sample from every donation. So we would have got out the archive sample from the donation, all the donations that the patient had received, and would retest them to see if any had slipped through the testing. Because, of course, we wouldn't know whether it was hepatitis B or non-A, non-B hepatitis. So, of course, until 1991, there was no test for hepatitis C as it became, but they would certainly have been tested for all the markers of hepatitis B.
And then once you'd identified the sample that was the sample that was the problem, did you then undertake the tracing through to other recipients and the donor?
Certainly the donor. I can't remember how far back they went, because I don't recall dealing with any cases in terms of previous donations. It would have depended what would be found in the donor, how far back it would be possible to go. But of course, there would be cases referred to as possible post-transfusion hepatitis that turned out to be something else. I mean, there was a sad case of a woman who had a heart transplant and received lots and lots of blood, but had actually been infected with hepatitis C from the donated heart. So these cases could be a bit tricky to sort out.
And then once donor records were on the computer, did that process become any more straightforward?
Well, it certainly became quicker because there was no need to go and ferret through boxes of 101 cards.
Can I pick up one document in relation to this? NHBT 0041286_003, please. It's a management group meeting from February 1991, and if we turn to the second page of it, we can see at point 3 access to donor records on computer, and I think this is what you were talking about earlier, but just for the sake of the record, it was explained that on-call MLSOs did not have access to the computerised donor records, and on occasions it was necessary for them to obtain information relating to donation numbers. This occurred when donors telephoned out of working hours, providing information which could affect recent donations and could result in the donation being withdrawn. Only the duty medical officer had full access to donor records. It will be further investigated to see how best to resolve the problem without breaching the requirements of the Data Protection Act. I think that was the scenario you were telling us about earlier.
It was. So when TRACE was designed, there were two sections to it. There was the section that had all the donor information, including their virus test results. And then there was the manufacturing part, which dealt with all the components and which hospitals they'd gone to. And for reasons of confidentiality, the two sections of the computer were kept as separate as possible. So the on-call MLSOs, the technical staff, had access to the manufacturing section, so they could withdraw components and so on, but they couldn't access the donor part. So if a donor rang in, having donated, with information that necessitated the withdrawal of components, the medical person on duty had to come in and deal with that. So because we had to get into the donor records to put the donor on hold, as well as withdrawing, or to link which components had been made from that donor, and to make sure they were all withdrawn. So there was eventually a technical fix. I can't remember the details, but there was a way that eventually put in place of allowing the on-call staff access without breaching data protection. Because as it happened, I lived near the hospital and could get in quite quickly, but there was obviously a time pressure to get these components withdrawn.
And then under point 5, BPL plasma, Dr. Rankin gave details of information from BPL on the contamination of a pool of plasma. As a result of this, all donations contributed by Cambridge to that pool had to be rechecked. This was very necessary but time-consuming. The new equipment being purchased for data storage would make this task more easy to complete in future. So this relates to a BPL pool. What was the process in that regard?
So once BPL had pooled all the plasma that they were going to use for manufacture of that pool, they would test the pool, and occasionally the pool would test positive. And of course that pool may contain plasma from more than one transfusion centre, so we were all notified of all the donations which had contributed to the pool from Cambridge, and we would then take out the archive sample from every single donation and retest them individually. Now, obviously, they had all tested negative, in real time. Otherwise, we wouldn't have used the plasma for BPL. But they all had to be retested. So, I mean, it didn't happen very often, but it was a big task.
And in terms of the transfusion centre's role of distributing BPL products to the hospitals, was the centre ever involved in recall of a finished product that had been issued by BPL?
I don't remember any recalls.
Thank you. I want to move on then to...
Can I, before you move on, just ask a question rising out of this? This began with Council asking about the duty to report post-transfusion hepatitis. Now, so far as the patient is concerned, that report would have to come from some clinician attending the patient. Your source of information would be the hospital. How would a hospital actually identify, or be expected, in theory, to identify all cases of post-transfusion hepatitis? If it was hepatitis B, for instance, there might be quite an incubation period before there was any fulminant jaundice. If it was hepatitis non-A, non-B, there might be never any acute symptomatology within 6 months. And by the time 6, 7, 8 months have passed, and the nature of the symptoms being non-specific in general terms, how would it ever get back to the hospital to report back to you to deal with removing a donation which by then would have been well used, one would have thought?
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, it depended on the hospital. It depended on the patient having symptoms or signs, turning yellow or feeling ill. It depended on, it could have been the GP, because as you say, the patient may long have gone home, thinking of hepatitis in the first place, and thinking, did that person receive a transfusion in the hospital? Now, the GP may or may not have been told that the patient was transfused. The patient may or may not have been told that they were transfused. So a report did depend on lots of things lining up. you know, the patient having symptoms, someone realizing they had hepatitis, someone realizing they'd had a transfusion and thinking, could this hepatitis be due to the transfusion? Because, of course, there are other types of hepatitis that are not viruses, and hepatitis B might have been caught in the hospital. So it was a bit of detective work.
The system relying upon the report of illness in the patient, as you've just really described, is not so much a case of the stable door being closed after the horse is bolted, but also the gate to the yard.
Well, indeed. Well, indeed. I mean, short of testing every transfused patient several months later, that is the route of reporting. So
if one's going to cover or to protect against the risk of a transfusion transmitting hepatitis, which may result in post-transfusion hepatitis, there has to be really start at the other end, and that is testing the donation, presumably.
Well, of course, that's what we were always aiming to do. I mean, hepatitis B testing started, I think, in 1971 or 72. The frustration was there was no specific test for hepatitis C all through the 80s. And it was just wonderful when a test did appear, because at last we had a reliable way of preventing transmission of hepatitis C. But it's quite true, until you have a test, then there is always going to be a vulnerability for any infection of donations infecting a patient.
Yes, thank you very much.
I want to move to the hepatitis C screening.
Yes.
Work. Could we have NHBT 0041230_001, please? And we'll start at page 4 of it. Thank you. It's the management group meeting from the 11th of February 1991. And if we go to the bottom of the page, we can see a heading, AntiHCV testing. Dr. Rankin gave details of her discussions with commercial representatives and the various systems available, Abbott and Ortho. First of all, who was Dr. Rankin?
Dr. Angela Rankin was an associate specialist, qualified haematologist in the centre.
She was of the opinion that the proposals from Ortho would better suit our virology laboratory's operation, and she would recommend this system. From a rough estimate of costs, it would appear that the introduction of HCV testing would be some £350,000 plus per annum. Concern was expressed that no additional funds were to be provided and that these costs would need to be recovered from product pricing. It was agreed that Dr. McDougall should write to Dr. O'Brien, copy to Dr. Gunson, explaining the situation of asking that consideration be given for additional funds to be made available. Again, who was Dr. O'Brien?
Dr. O'Brien was the regional medical director at the Regional Health Authority.
So if there was going to be any additional funding, it would have come from the Regional Health Authority, and that's hence the letter to Dr. O'Brien. Do you have any recollection of what the £350,000 was made up of? What was involved in that figure?
Well, there was the test kits themselves and any capital equipment that was needed. I think we needed 1 or 2 extra scientific staff in the laboratory, but there was also the cost of an additional consultant to undertake the donor discussion. So counselling we tended not to use because nobody was a trained counsellor. So what became known as the post-test discussion, it was decided that we needed an extra consultant to do that work. And the region actually were very amenable and did come up with the funding. So we were able to, we had Dr. Elizabeth Caffrey as a locum. We were able to keep her on as a substantive consultant. And thereafter, she led on all of the donor work in relation to hepatitis C screening, and then later on look back.
Could we have NHBT 0041282_003, please? So this is a management group meeting now in April 1991, and if we turn to the next page, we have the heading Anti-HCV testing at the top of the page. A letter from Dr. Gunson indicated that 3 RTCs were undertaking an evaluation of the second generation of anti-HCV testing kits, and this was expected to delay the introduction of routine testing until the 1st of September 1991. Now, the inquiry's already looked at a number of documents in relation to that. I just want to pick up the particular situation in East Anglia. The RHA had agreed to fund direct to the RTC the first-year tests from contingency monies and had asked for a detailed costing of the introduction of the full testing for the year 1991-1992. As funds are being made available, the director, so that was Professor Alain,
Yes.
said he would prefer to introduce routine testing at an early date. The timing of this would depend upon the conclusion of the research that Dr. Caffrey was undertaking. The National Directorate would be informed that Cambridge would commence routine testing as soon as possible and would not necessarily await the outcome of the test kit evaluation. First of all, what was the research that Dr. Caffrey was undertaking? Do you have any recollection of that?
No, and I can't unearth what that might have been, but I did find a statement at some point to the effect that I think she was doing some pilot work of test kits separate from the national study, because the conclusion was if she found any positives, then Cambridge would go ahead earlier, perhaps earlier than other centres. Now, as it happened, at some point, Professor Alain seems to have changed his mind on.
We will get
Well,
that.
right.
Just
okay.
let's
but
stay with
I'm not
this.
absolutely sure what the research.
Not
was.
sure what the research was. Can you tell us anything of what you recall in relation to this date, April 1991, about why Professor Alain felt that testing should start as soon as possible without waiting for the evaluation? Was there any discussion about that?
I don't remember a great deal of discussion, but I remember a general feeling that if we're ready, why not go? What would be the point of delaying any longer than we had to?
Then if we look at NHBT 0041278, please. Page 2 of the document, Paul. Thank you. An executive meeting, I think it's the same as the management group meeting.
Yes.
20th of May 1991, and towards the end of that page we have the heading Anti-HCV testing. The director reported on his discussions with Dr. O'Brien, who agreed the costs as provided and would support the submission to the regional executive. In the discussion, the director reported that it was agreed that should one or more HCV confirmed positive be discovered, then routine testing should commence immediately. Depending how the current investigations progressed, a commencement date of July was likely. So I think what you were saying a moment ago was that there was something to do with Dr. Caffrey's research.
Yes, I think they must have been piloting how this was going to work in practice. But because this was a study, obviously there could have been positives that came up, in which case we would start testing immediately. That's all. That I'm afraid is all I can remember.
And again, do you have any recollection of any discussions about what the thinking was in relation to the nationally agreed date and whether there were discussions about Cambridge going ahead?
Over and above this, I don't remember any particular discussion.
In fact, you're fairly confident that East Anglia Centre didn't start testing until the 1st of September 1991.
We did not, that's correct. We went with the national date in the end.
Do you have any recollection at all of why that was?
Sorry.
With the benefit of hindsight, do you think testing should have started earlier at the Transfusion Centre, even if that meant that it was out of step with other transfusion centres?
Well, this is a very difficult situation to try and recall 30 years later in the light of what's happened. I mean, it's obvious that we should have gone earlier nationally, you know, not just in Cambridge, everywhere should have gone. I think it does get awkward when, for a supposedly national service, centres are not all doing the same thing at the same time. It would have created a lot of difficulty, had lots of centres, had lots of different start dates, but on the other hand, more patients would have been protected. So it's interesting maybe to compare what happened under the National Blood Authority, where it was recognised that some centres would be ready to introduce new things earlier, and the approach was then a date by which everybody had to be doing something, but if you were ready earlier, you went ahead with it. You didn't wait for the pace of the slowest.
And so looking, we're going to pick this up again a little bit later as well, but looking back on more recent practice where that's been the approach by the MBA, again with the benefit of hindsight, as a profession, do you think that things could and should have been different?
Well, I think the whole country should have gone earlier.
And as a profession, do you think that the decisions around hepatitis C testing, lessons have been learned from that?
Yes, absolutely.
In terms of regions going separately?
Yes, exactly. Because, of course, under the National Blood Authority, there were different blood centres, but under a single management structure. And for various reasons, whatever we were introducing, was it white cell filtering or another manufacturing change, some centres would be ready to go live and ahead of others. And that was not discouraged. That was accepted as part and parcel of the implementation. But then there would be a definite must-do by a certain date. And that generally would mean everything on the shelf must have been tested in a particular way or put through a new process, so that we could be saying to hospitals, everything you will get from us from this day onwards will have been tested or manufactured in the new way.
In terms of that question of everything on the shelf, going back to September 1991, obviously if testing starts on a particular day, there will be blood that's ready to go out to hospital that hasn't perhaps been screened. Do you have any recollection of what happened with unscreened blood in the Cambridge?
No, and I've been trying to remember whether we actually started testing 3 weeks before, so that everything on the shelf that day would have been tested, but I'm afraid I can't remember which we did.
Before we move on to the role you held as honorary consultant clinical lead for blood components in 1994, I just want to pick up two matters within your research that you were doing in the early 90s, and they do overlap in time. In terms of the first point is solvent detergent FFP. In January 1992, you've said that Professor Allen had been approached by Octapharma to see whether the Cambridge Centre and the University of Cambridge would conduct a clinical trial in solvent detergent FFP. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Can you tell us in terms that a layman would understand what SD-FFP was?
Yes. So if we think of viruses like HIV and hepatitis C, the surface of them has got a fatty coating. And a group in New York actually had developed a way of treating plasma so that this fatty coating of viruses would be dissolved and the virus then would not survive. So this used a solvent and a detergent, a bit like washing up liquid, but fancier, to dissolve that fatty coat of the virus. And then the chemicals would be removed at the end of the process, leaving a plasma in which viruses with a fatty coat would be killed. Now, that sounds wonderful, but there were two problems. One was it couldn't be applied to individual units of plasma. You had to create a pool, but the pools were of several hundred donations, not thousands, as in the manufacture of clotting factors. The second problem is that not all viruses have a fatty covering. So viruses like hepatitis A and another virus called parvo B19, which is of concern because it can affect the bone marrow, don't have a fatty coat. And of course, the question of was the pooling then going to perhaps increase the risk of those because they weren't taken out by the inactivation procedure. So what was required was that the pools of plasma had to contain certain levels of antibodies, certainly to hepatitis A, and they would be tested for hepatitis A virus and B19 virus. So that at that time, in 1991, 1992, this was the only method available for the virus inactivation of fresh frozen plasma. So we thought it was definitely worth investigating.
You've told us which pathogens were not eliminated, but which pathogens were eliminated?
So importantly, HIV, hepatitis B, and hepatitis C.
And then another element of your research related to methylene blue. Again, can you tell us in layman terms what that involved?
So this is another method for inactivating viruses in fresh frozen plasma. This time it can be applied to individual units of plasma. And it involves adding a chemical called methylene blue, which has been used as a medication way back historically. But the methylene blue, when you expose it to certain wavelengths of light, would generate byproducts, if you like, that would kill viruses in the product. And it seemed to have two advantages. One, there was no pooling involved. And secondly, it didn't depend on this fatty coat. It could attack a wider range of viruses. The downside, as far as some clinicians were concerned, particularly pediatricians, was that at least in the early versions of this technology, the methylene blue wasn't removed, so it ended up going into the patient. And pediatricians were concerned that, particularly, for example, premature babies wouldn't be able to break down the methylene blue that was there, and that could cause problems.
You've provided the inquiry with a paper that you were involved in writing in the British Journal of Haematology in 2000. Just for the purposes of the transcript, the reference to it is NHBT 0042349. We won't go to it, but just to note that in that paper, it's written that since 1992, the German Red Cross has treated more than 1.5 million units of plasma with methylene blue, and the range of viruses inactivated has been well documented, including some non-enveloped viruses as well as many lipid-enveloped ones. The paper goes on to highlight some of the difficulties with the method. But can you tell us a little bit about why it was being used in Germany from 1992, but not in the UK?
So the method was invented by Dr. Harold Moore, who worked for the German Red Cross, which was the supplier of blood within Germany. So it was, for a while, it was his invention, and it was used in-house in the German Red Cross. So at some point, they commercialized the equipment. So you needed, the methylene blue was added, but then the bag of plasma had to go onto a light box to be treated. And so they teamed up initially with Baxter for production of light boxes. And then Baxter started it got to a point where they could market this product for assessment by other blood services. And so at that point, which I think was around 1996, we picked that up and did an assessment of it.
In terms of either of those technologies, is it your view that either of them should have been introduced in the UK any earlier?
So both of these products required licensing by the MCA. Solvent detergent FFP was a drug because the plasma was pooled, so it was in the same class of medicine as clotting factor concentrates, albumin, and immunoglobulin. So until it was licensed, no one could prescribe it, and the company couldn't market it. So our clinical trial wasn't specifically done for licensing, but I think it helped it did help the company to obtain a product license. So, of course, the obtaining of a license is a matter for the company, and until the company does that, one is stuck. One might want to prescribe it because the clinical trial went well. It provided good correction of clotting. There were no horrible side effects, and nobody caught any viruses, although the trial was not that huge. So it would have been good had it been available earlier, but it simply wasn't licensed. The same was true of the methylene blue system, although that's not a drug, but it's licensed nevertheless as a piece of medical equipment. And again, that wasn't licensed until 1998. So we could do trials in the laboratory. We could have done a clinical trial. We didn't, as it happened. But again, it couldn't be prescribed and administered until it was licensed.
I want to move on now to look back. You've provided a statement in relation to look back, and I just want to pick up one of the points in your statement. It's perhaps we can put it up on the screen, Paul. WITN 0643001, and I'd like to put up paragraph 11, please. It's on page 13. Paragraph 11. You were asked the question, when was the duty of care to patients and donors first recognised by NHSBT? You say, I can't comment on any corporate position on this point. Ever since I entered the transfusion service in 1986, there's been an implicit assumption that as medical professionals, doctors working in transfusion services had a duty of care to our donors. We also recognised the duty we had to support hospital clinicians and GPs who were caring directly for patients who had received our blood components. This support might be specific to individual patients by providing additional information on the transfusions they'd received, or generic, e.g. by evaluating and implementing new methods for improving the safety of our blood components. So that was what you've said about your understanding of the duty of care. Could we then have NHBT 0057381 _ 004, please? In August 1994, you attended an ad hoc meeting of experts in Birmingham on behalf of SACT, the Standing Advisory Committee on Transfusion Transmitted Infection, which was specifically to discuss the question of look back.
Yes, I think all members of SACT were there, plus some external experts like Dr. Mutimer from the liver unit in Birmingham, and Dr. Gillen and Professor Cash from Scotland.
And we can see that there is then a discussion that follows on that at that meeting. Firstly, what data is currently available, and there was discussion of a paper by AOB in relation to the risk of hepatitis C. And if we go over the page, we see that the conclusions of that paper are summarised, that some 83 components were prepared from 63 anti-HCV positive previous donations of these blood donors, although only 58% of the components were actually transfused. 39 recipients were identified, but only 9 were ultimately traceable and alive. All of these individuals were anti-HCV positive. Of 39 recipients identified, 69% had died, none survived beyond 5 years after transfusion, and 8% were not found. It was estimated that there were approximately 1.2 recipients for each individual donation. And then there is a review of the data, which, there's a set of comments that had been raised at the meeting in relation to that review. The proportion of untransfused components was atypically high in this particular study. The proportion of recipient deaths was higher than the figure of 50%, which was usually cited in the literature. Infectivity of implicated donors was very high, even greater than reported by CLB Amsterdam and Linköping 76% at ISBT. The mean age of recipients was not reported, but most survivors were said to be in their 50s. And then there's a comment, although most blood recipients may be middle-aged or old, a very substantial proportion are children or young adults. Infected recipients were asymptomatic with a normal ALT, although one had progressive liver disease currently under interferon treatment. And then there's another comment, even though earlier data from several centres, including Birmingham, suggested that HCV causes mild liver disease, further follow-up now indicates a more aggressive, progressive evolution, citing Mutimer and Tedder. Then on the next page, in addition, HCV liver disease appears to be more aggressive in old age, irrespective of the duration of infection in post-transfusion cases compared with IVDU and in the immunodeficient. Absence of symptoms, a normal ALT or a poor index of liver pathology. Then there's a discussion about the efficacy of treatment with interferon with or without ribavirin. And we then turn the page to paragraph 3. Consideration of other potential competing demands on BTS or NHS systems, expenditure such as the introduction of anti-HBC testing for tail-end HBV carriers, HTLV1, 2 screening, etc., was brief, as it was felt that each of these deserved individual evaluation in their own right. It was generally acknowledged that we in the blood transfusion service do have an ethical responsibility and duty of care towards recipients of potentially infectious blood components, such that they deserve to be identified, counselled, tested and offered treatment where that is appropriate. It was felt that despite the current uncertainties regarding long-term efficacy of treatment and its impact upon the natural history of hepatitis C, we have a moral obligation to inform and advise surviving potentially infected blood recipients. If we just pause there, we'll come to the rest of the document in a moment. It could be suggested that this appears to be a recognition of a new duty of care, and that this duty of care towards recipients was something new at this point in time, in 1994. Would that be fair, or was the perspective that it had always existed?
Well, I don't think it was entirely new, in that when HIV screening was introduced in 1985, a look back was done at that point. So it was well recognised that the transfusion service's duty of care went above and beyond the things I had listed there, and reached out to individual patients who'd become infected so that we could play our part in making sure they received the care that they needed at the time. I think with hepatitis C, there was such a long period when there was no treatment, and I'm afraid medicine in the 1980s was perhaps a bit paternalistic in terms of not wishing to give people bad news without there being some treatment on offer, that perhaps the tendency was too far the other way, to withhold information, which people should have had.
But in terms of the gap between the date of screening being introduced in 1991 to this meeting in 1994, if that duty of care had always existed, what had changed?
So at some point, MSBT had considered look back and had concluded it was not appropriate to do it. And of course, the blood services couldn't do look back without funding, without a mandate from the Department of Health. So I think this meeting in '94 was the blood services' way of trying to gather information and a groundswell of opinion to persuade MSBT to change their mind and have another think about it. And I think then, in the October of 1994, MSBT did form a subgroup to consider look back, and then made the decision in December 1994 that look back should happen. So I think the blood services, were behind the change of view, perhaps, by MSBT.
From your own view, from your own perspective, do you think that look back should have happened at least in 1991 once the screening was in place?
Well, yes. I mean, you know, I think medicine was being too paternalistic in deciding that, or the decision makers, which was MSBT at that point, that because we had no specific treatment to offer people, they shouldn't be told, which of course, with hindsight, is ridiculous, because there were lots of things that people would have benefited from knowing. Firstly, what had happened to them. Secondly, advice on alcohol and so on. And thirdly, I think it became evident hepatitis C causes a lot of quite non-specific symptoms, which people may have taken to their GP and perhaps been fobbed off with, you know, can't find anything wrong with you. And even just, I think, for people to know, yes, you do have an illness, this is how you acquired it, and that's what's making you feel tired and rotten, and, you know, you're not making it up, would have been very, very useful for people, even if there were no drugs available at the time.
If we can just go to the next page of this document to look at the options that were being discussed. The first option, number one, confine itself to the role of an information clearinghouse, providing hospitals with the identity of implicated blood components, leaving it to them and general practitioners to follow up potential recipients. It was felt that this policy would not be effective in practice. Can you tell us a little bit about why not?
I think we felt that was too little. We felt that, given the magnitude and severity of the problem, that was a bit hit and miss, you know. What if the hospital didn't follow up the patient? What if the general practitioner didn't follow up the patient? We felt we owed it to the recipients to make sure that they had been contacted, that the right discussion had been had with them, and that they were able to be referred to a liver specialist with hopefully a specialist counsellor in the liver team to help them come to terms with this diagnosis.
And then the second option, trace implicated recipients through hospitals and GPs, interview and counsel surviving recipients. By counsel, I know you prefer the wording post-test discussion. Obtain and test a sample of blood from them, refer infected patients for specialist counselling, investigation and possible treatment by hepatology centres. The latter option was generally favoured, although it wasn't clear how the added costs of the specialist reference centres would be defrayed. Further discussion took place as to how far back recipients should be traced, since few, if any, recipients were likely to be traceable and alive more than 5 years after transfusion. If we can pause there, what was the basis for that assertion, that few, if any, recipients were likely to be traceable and alive more than 5 years after transfusion?
So taking these separately, so of course these would be people transfused before 1991, when hospital records would have been more or less entirely manual. And hospital record storage was very variable. I mean, records were very often put in some damp basement, and I'm sure Dr. Hewitt will cover what did happen when Look Back was started. Getting hold of hospital records from the past was tricky, so I think that's probably what that refers to. Of course, even if the record was available, the recipient might have moved house, they may have changed their name, they may be lost to follow up in some way. I'm slightly surprised by the few would be alive at 5 years. That may be a reference to the AYOB paper, where that was what was found. That's quite pessimistic. But I think even in that paper, they did note that, of course, if somebody were, say, a premature baby when they were transfused, or a child, or a woman who'd bled after childbirth, or a young man who'd come off his motorbike, of course they're going to be alive if they survive the acute episode. They're going to be alive for decades. So they had to be taken very much into account.
So that wouldn't be your experience?
Well, I may be influenced, because we did a study later on, which I've mentioned in my witness statement, to actually try and gather some up-to-date data on why people were receiving transfusions and how long they lived afterwards. And we followed up for 10 years and found a much higher percentage of survival than this would indicate.
Is that the Easter study?
It is, yes.
Since you raise it, let's look at that, and we will. Sorry, we'll come to that in just a moment. Let me finish this document, and I'll mark that as where we'll go next. 5 years after transfusion, and since sufficient archive samples were unlikely to be available to permit the identification of a seroconversion date, most anti-HCV positive donors were probably infected in the 1970s. I think it says a retrospective analysis carried out as far back as possible would be the most reasonable policy to adopt. Given the concerns about how easy it would be to go backwards, would it be right and fair to say that by delaying from 1991 to 1995 to do the look back, those problems were even greater than they would have been?
Well, indeed, it certainly didn't help. There were, there may have been 4 years' worth of records which we could have found in 1991, but by 1995 had gone.
On reflection, Sarah, I'll come back to the Easter study a little bit later today in relation to better blood transfusion practice, and we'll pick up that 5-year survival point then, but it's called the Easter study, and we will look at that later. Let's stay with look back until lunchtime.
I'm just interested at the moment in what is said at the bottom of the page there, where the assertion is made that most anti-HCV positive donors were probably infected in the 1970s. What was the basis for that, as far as you can remember, as opposed to the 1970s and 80s, any time before testing, in fact?
Yes, I was slightly wondering that myself. I'm not sure why that's stated so definitively. I don't.
You said already that the outcome of that meeting was then that SACTI recommended to the MSBT that a look back should be undertaken, and ultimately that was what was addressed. Your next involvement, I think, was when you received a memo, or the next significant involvement was when you received a memo from Dr. Robinson in January 1995.
Yes.
If we could put that up on the screen, please, Paul. It is NHBT 00415. Sorry, NHBT 0011115.
If we can't,
We've
we
got
can.
it. It was my fault, sir, for saying 4 ones. That was the
Yes.
the flaw in it. This is a letter from Dr. Robinson. It's to the medical director, in fact, of the North East Thames Centre, but in fact you received an identical one, as far as you recall. It encloses a copy of the definitive version of the action to be undertaken by RTCs, which will be presented at the working group. And we see in the second paragraph of the letter, this represents the first stage of the HCV look-back programme for which the MBS has sole responsibility. I'm sending a copy of this to you now to clarify exactly what's expected of each RTC at this stage. Guidelines for how to proceed beyond this stage will be provided as quickly as possible by the UK Ad Hoc MSBT Working Party. Please, therefore, at present, do not go beyond the point of preparing the data ready for issue to the hospital concerned. I will release guidelines of how to proceed beyond this stage as soon as they've been drawn up and agreed by the Ad Hoc MSBT Working Party. Then, if we turn the page, we have the action, the programme. Number 1. all reference laboratory confirmed HCV antibody positive donors to be identified and their donor record examined. There's no requirement to follow up donors whose final result is deemed to be indeterminate. Now, indeterminate testing we will come back to. But in relation to the HCV antibody positive donors that are identified, who was it? Were they the donors who had been identified as positive since 1991, or those who were identified as positive from 95?
Oh, from 1991, from the day we started.
From the date of screening?
Yes.
Number 2, all donations given prior to the index HCV antibody positive donation to be identified by donation number, together with all the unfractionated blood components prepared from these previous donations. The fate of all these previously donated units and their associated unfractionated components must be established, but it notes that plasma that went for fractionation doesn't need to be traced back. 4, a list of all components issued to each hospital must be prepared. This list must provide the donation number, the type of component, and the date of issue to the hospital. Regardless of how far back individual hospital records are kept, the NBS must endeavour to provide a complete list of components issued and the date of issue for each previous donation from reference laboratory identified anti-HCV positive donors. This is crucial information, as even if the hospitals no longer have records going back far enough, at least the NBS will still be able to provide an estimate of how many potentially at-risk recipients cannot be traced and when, at which hospital they were transfused. And then 5, based on available data, it's sensible to work on the assumption that all previous donations were potentially infectious. It's not therefore considered necessary to test archived samples for the presence of anti-HCV. An exception could be made where individual patient circumstances make it desirable to know whether or not they were put at risk, i.e. in individual patients where it would be preferable not to inform them that they'd been put at risk unless the presence of an HCV infection would alter their management. Can you assist us at all in relation to that final point of the circumstances in which it would be desirable to know whether or not they were put at risk, where they're not going to be told, but it might change their management?
I find that quite a difficult scenario to envisage, to be honest. I mean, there were obviously patients whose GP or consultant decided that they shouldn't be told, patients who were at the end of their life, patients who had dementia or similar circumstances on compassionate grounds. But I'm struggling to think of a scenario where it was better not to inform them, but it was important to know whether they had been infected with hepatitis C. I'm sorry, I'll think about it, but at the moment I can't think of a scenario where that would apply.
At the moment, I'm having the same difficulty as you are, because the last 2 lines start with IE.
Yes.
In other words, it's looking at individual patient circumstances, make it desirable to know whether or not they were put at risk. That's telling the patient, or not. In individual patients where it would be preferable not to inform them that they've been put at risk unless the presence of an HCV infection will alter their management. Now, if the management of the patient is something you're not discussing with the patient, but for very particular reasons, because the patient may have dementia or something similar, and therefore wouldn't understand if you told them, why would telling them make a difference? You need to tell the clinician. So I don't really follow what's being got at.
No. I mean, it was not unknown in medicine, of course, for clinicians and sometimes relatives to have information which the patient themselves didn't have. But I can't quite get my head around this one.
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Williamson, your recollection is that at the Cambridge, the East Anglia Transfusion Centre, a locum consultant, Dr. Pollock, who'd been appointed in the absence of Professor Allen, was then retained part-time in anticipation of the look-back work.
Yes.
And that they undertook this work alongside Dr. Caffrey. And so your involvement on the ground in the look-back work was fairly limited.
Yes, that's right. I was managing the component and issue department. Those were my areas. But in the absence of Professor Allen, I was also looking after the testing laboratory. So the donor work was allocated to Dr. Caffrey and Dr. Pollock.
But you still received a number of the memos from zonal management about what was required.
Yes, there was a period in 1995 when we were in transition from the RTC being managed by the region to being managed by the National Blood Authority. And for a few months, some centres had if you like, a caretaker director. So Dr. McDougall had gone back to the region at the end of 1994 because the RHA no longer was managing the centre. But the zonal structure was still being put in place. So I was asked to act as the named director for a few months, and therefore I received all the correspondence from Dr. Robinson about look back.
If we turn to NHBT 0040594_001, please. This is a memo from Dr. Knowles dealing with look back, dated the 21st of March 1995. She's enclosing a further request from Angela, Dr. Robinson, received yesterday, and inviting comments. She then flags some concerns that she had in discussion with Pat Hewitt. In no particular order, we all need access to the final look-back form, letters and follow-up pro forma as soon as possible, and with sufficient time to decide how best these can be handled locally. So it would appear that as at the 21st of March, the regional transfusion centres had still not received the form, letters or pro formas that you were expected to use. Is that in accordance with your recollection?
Beyond this, I can't honestly remember.
To some of us with vast amounts of data would prefer to generate the look-back forms electronically, and we need to persuade Angela that it's a desirable option. We need to have knowledge of the entire look-back system before we go live, i.e. clarification of testing sites, follow-up pro forma and informed staff. Ideally, we should have access to the contents of the CMO letter a few hours before our hospital colleagues. And point 4, it would be desirable, with knowledge of all these facts, if we could be spared some days to think through our local systems and ensure that we have the necessary clerical and medical staff familiar with the procedures. Again, I'm aware your recollection may be very limited, but do you have any recollection of your colleagues flagging any of these concerns that things were, they didn't know what was happening, effectively?
Not specifically. If you think about this London and South East zone, for which Sue Knowles was the clinical director, the London centres, so Brentwood, Colindale and Tooting, were larger, and of course London on the whole was a much higher HCV area than East Anglia. So I think they had a much bigger task than we had in East Anglia. When we started screening in 1991, I think we found about 3 positives per week, which was a small number compared to what they were dealing with in London. And then, of course, so their look-backs would have been correspondingly much bigger. I did note at one point we did allocate an additional scientist to work with Dr. Caffrey and Dr. Pollock. That's Dr. Charlotte Llewellyn, on the sort of nuts and bolts of data trawling and getting all the information that was required. But I don't think our problems were as great as the London centres.
And then if we look at NHBT 0012321_001, please. It's a memo from the 24th of March 1995, again from Dr. Knowles. I received a phone call from Peter Flanagan yesterday confirming that the look back will go ahead on the 3rd of April. He also confirmed that the DOH are centrally printing all the look back forms, the drafts of which are enclosed. It's hoped we shall be receiving these on Friday the 31st of March, together with the standard letters. The CMO letter will be distributed on the 3rd of April. The contents apparently have not been finalised, but it's expected to give the format of the look back and contain examples of all the documents and counselling guidelines. There's points about funding, and then the very last sentence: if anyone has gleaned any more than I have, please do share it. The last sentence might suggest there was somewhat limited communication with the local centres about what was expected of them. Was that your sense of the situation as well?
I don't remember specifically, but the fact that the letters were coming on a Friday and the look back was to start on the Monday wouldn't have given the centre much time to think about the content and get ready. I have a sense that Dr. Knowles was feeling a bit frustrated by the short time scales for preparation.
You've set out in your statement that the practicalities of look back were undertaken in the same way as the memo from Dr. Robinson had set out, and that there was significant work to do in terms of looking through records. Once the list of products and components had been identified at the transfusion centre, that was then provided to hospitals.
Yes, so each hospital would have a list of all of the components ever issued to them as far back as we could go from donors who, after September 1991, were found to be hepatitis C positive.
And you've said in your statement that for recipients whose hospital records showed they were not deceased, you think then the GP was contacted to establish whether the recipient was still alive and whether it was appropriate to contact them or not.
Yes, and that's a very understandable step, because only a GP can know whether a patient is in a state to receive what will be a hugely shocking bit of news.
Do you have any sense of how many GPs chose not to tell the patient?
I don't. There were certainly some who didn't want to be the bearer of the news themselves. There were some who said they noted this, but were happy for the blood service to approach the patient and undertake the discussion with them. So it was a very much a mixed picture across East Anglia. I think most GPs were good and made the first approach to the patient before they were then able to come and speak to one of our consultants. But there were inevitably a few who were less happy to do so.
And then if we move forward to 1996, 8th of January 96, the MSBT met that day. And I know you weren't a member of the committee, but I just want to pick up a set of minutes so we can explore some of the issues that are raised in them. DHSC 0020692_118, please, Paul. And if we go to the second page, there is discussion about the number of people who had been identified. And then if we pick it up at 4.4, the chairman mentioned increasing press inquiries about why the exercise was going slowly and asking why ministers were not taking action. One option was to abandon the look back and offer hepatitis C tests to anyone who'd been transfused. Members were not in favour of this, as the look back exercise had been planned to ensure the right patients were identified, properly counselled and, as appropriate, referred for further investigation after a positive test. In addition, the look back was expected to produce important information about hepatitis C, The alternative to simply letting the exercise run on as it was action to try and speed up completion. Simply sending out messages of exhortation from the centre seemed unlikely to produce action in the field. Hospital records and counselling, for which there was shortage of suitably trained staff, were identified as key bottlenecks. The chairman re-emphasised the initial conclusion that counselling must be done well, patients must not be misinformed. Dr. Robinson reported that counselling was being done effectively by transfusion staff, but they faced a heavy load because many GPs were unable or unwilling to undertake that role. And then suggestions were made going forwards of what to do. From your experience at the East Anglia Transfusion Centre and what your colleagues were talking to you about, what were the key issues at your centre that slowed look back down?
It was the issue of the hospitals tracking down the medical records of the patient, because the hospitals didn't receive any extra staff to do this. The records were very likely by then to be in a basement somewhere, to be off-site, very not necessarily easy to track down. And it was taking a long time for the medical records departments to get hold of the records, which contained obviously the important information of the GP and so on. So that was a bottleneck. As I mentioned, East Anglia didn't have the numbers of donors and therefore the number of patients in the look back that some of the London centres had. And I think we were fortunate. We had interested hepatologists, particularly in Cambridge. Dr. Graham Alexander had an interest in hepatitis C, and he was very happy to see patients referred from Dr. Caffrey. And I think the hepatologists in Norwich and elsewhere didn't see this as a huge extra burden. I was trying to remember whether they had trained counsellors as part of their hepatology team. We certainly didn't in the blood centre. I think it seemed to us that specialist counselling should be done alongside the patient's clinical care, and it would have been odd, I think, for us to have got involved in the psychological support to patients when we weren't in a position to treat them clinically. It seemed to us that that should all be part and parcel of the service that they would receive at their hospital hepatology clinic.
Just thinking about the look back slightly more broadly than the nitty-gritty of East Anglia, obviously the whole premise of the look back depended on donors who tested positive returning to give blood some point after 1991 so that they were identified and look back could be undertaken. So if a donor didn't give blood after 1991, then look back wouldn't take place. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
Was there any discussion that you were involved in about that and the fact that some people would therefore be missed by the look back?
Yes, I don't recall being in a room where that was discussed in a major way. I think everyone was so focused on trying to do what we could do. That was the route MSBT had decided to go down. We were very happy now that this was happening. We wanted to get on with it. There was always a recognition that there would be patients not picked up by this process. But short of a public health campaign or some other means, there was nothing really the blood services could do because we didn't know which patients had received blood. We don't retain records of any most specific patients and which donor they received from. That's held in the hospital. So I think it was a case of getting on and doing what we could do in the best way we could do it.
And we talked earlier about the computer systems being limited to the particular regional transfusion centre. Is it right that a donor wouldn't just have to donate again after 1991, but they'd have to donate at each centre that they'd ever donated at before for them to be identified?
Well, I think we had a system for if we had on the donor's record that they had previous donations in another centre, which prior to computerisation would have had to be gathered from the centre, then we would have told the centre where they had previously donated. But I suppose it wasn't systematic that when a donor donated for the first time in East Anglia, someone would remember to ask them, and it would always systematically be documented that they had donated elsewhere. There may have been gaps there.
So there might have been gaps because the donor didn't remember where they donated, because it would rely on the donor being able to say, I donated here, here and here.
I think they would remember on the whole, but it would depend on someone remembering to ask them.
And somebody asking and recording it.
Yes.
You said in your statement you had no direct responsibility for look-back issues until you became Research and Medical Director in 2007. In the time from when you took up your post, 2007, until the Penrose report was published in 2015, again, was any consideration given to identifying those transfusion recipients who might have been missed in the look-back?
Not that I can recall, no.
The Penrose report was published in March 2015, and you alerted the NHSBT board to it the following day. You also then brought a paper to the board meeting in July 2015. Sorry. Could we have WITN 0643009, please, Paul? We can see this is a meeting of the 30th of July 2015, and if we turn to page 5, we can see just above the 1595 heading, the board received paper 1561, which covered points for reflection following the report from the Penrose inquiry, and this was well received. That's all that's noted in the minutes.
Yes.
If we then look at the paper that was brought to the board, WITN 0643008, please. And we'll go to page 110, please. I want to just highlight a few points and then I will ask you a question about it, Dr. Williamson. We can see the executive summary, the Penrose inquiry, which reported on the 25th of March 2015, had a remit to explore the circumstances, etc. The report made a single recommendation, which is that individuals in Scotland transfused before September 1991, when HCV screening of blood donors was introduced, should seek a test for HCV if not already performed. No such recommendation has been made in England, although we undertook patient look-back from HCV-positive donors in the mid-1990s. In addition, however, Penrose drew attention to a number of aspects of donor policy and patient care, which were considered not inappropriate at the time, but which would not meet today's standards. And then carrying on down, this review has concluded that there is strong assurance that many practices of the past would no longer apply, and that today's processes relating to safety, policy and implementation are much more consistent and transparent. There's then an appendix to your paper which goes through the Penrose observations and a note of what the current policy on that issue is. I'm not wanting to look at that with you, but what I want to go to is the question of the single recommendation made by Penrose, and that no such recommendation was made in England. Was there any discussion at the board meeting about the recommendation that had been made for Scotland?
So the recommendation in Penrose was directed to the Scottish Government, not to the Scottish Transfusion Service. And in practice, it was picked up by Health Protection Scotland, which launched a public awareness campaign. So SNBTS wasn't and couldn't be involved in that because neither SNBTS or, by analogy, the National Blood Service had the records of patients that we could have used in any way to identify people who had received transfusions across the board. I mean, I wish I'd been a bit more assiduous in trying to establish what discussions, if any, went on at in Public Health England, for example, or at the Department of Health, I think I was rather focused on what the blood service needed to do. And I don't really know to this day whether the Department of Health, in conjunction with Public Health England, considered launching a similar campaign to that in Scotland.
Was there any discussion at the board meeting about whether NHSBT should be pressing other bodies to do something similar?
I don't think there was.
Would it be fair then that the minutes of that board meeting that we looked at a moment ago, where it was simply noted, was probably the extent of what took place?
At the board, yes. Penrose was also discussed at a SABTO meeting around the same time. And as I recall, again, the discussion really focused on what the blood and transplant services could be doing in relation to the many points raised by Penrose. I don't recall any discussion of what we couldn't be doing. But that does seem like now that looks like a strange omission.
Just one final point on this before we break for lunch. Could we have, WITN 06430, sorry, Paul, let me start again. WITN 0643033. This is a Public Health Protection Unit newsletter published by the NHS of Greater Glasgow and Clyde. We can see under the heading Hepatitis C infection from NHS blood or blood products, it says this: the CMO recently circulated a letter regarding the detection of undiagnosed hepatitis C infection in Scotland. While the majority of cases are found among people with a history of injecting drug use, other infection routes are possible. The Penrose inquiry recommended efforts are made to reduce undiagnosed infection among patients who received blood or blood products prior to September 1991. All clinicians are asked to ensure that all patients with otherwise unexplained, persistently elevated ALT are offered a test for hepatitis C if they have not recently had one. A test should be offered even where the raised ALT could be associated with excessive alcohol consumption. The inquiries heard evidence from a number of witnesses who were not identified through the look-back process and, despite having been to their GP regularly, were not offered hepatitis C testing. We have this example from Scotland. Again, was any consideration given to a similar message going out to clinicians in England, within NHSBT?
Well, NHSBT couldn't have done this as the lead organisation. This would have required a mandate from the Department of Health and leader, as here, you see, this was led by the Public Health Protection Unit in Scotland. So these public campaigns have to be led by the public health experts.
Was there consideration of the board to press for anything like this?
No, I don't think there was. I don't think there was. And I was trying to find, when I found this online, I was trying to find what the outcome has been of the Scottish public health campaign, but I haven't so far been able to track that down on.
That's something that the inquiry has explored and will explore further. So I'm about to move on to a new topic, and I notice the time.
Yes. Well, we'll take a break now until 2:05, and I look forward to seeing you again then.